Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Barack Obama said, "The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are the people with something to hide." And a few days ago, Scientific American published this hit piece on a scientist who worked for the Obama administration. This article has 12 authors, including some of the most famous climate fraudsters in the world. I could spend an entire weekend enumerating the scientific fraud which these people have been involved with. Discussing that isn't the point of this video, but for historical reasons I will be mentioning Andrew Dessler. The scientist they're attacking is Steve Koonin, who has a best-selling book debunking climate alarmism. The Scientific American article is one long, continuous rant. They say the Earth is burning up and is the hottest it's been in 1,500 years. Then they attack Koonin for using an outdated 2014 assessment on hurricanes. Climate alarmists tell us that what they're doing is basic physics and has been settled for over 100 years. But apparently the science has to be rewritten every few years. Then the authors go on with their standard rant about how climate skeptics are being paid by big oil to destroy the world. They say Koonin isn't lying about having worked for the Obama administration, but he's certainly trying to portray himself as something better than he is, a crank who's only taken seriously by far-right disinformation peddlers hungry for anything they can use to score political points. He's just another denier trying to sell a book. Essentially everything which Scientific American is saying here is slanderous, it's incorrect, and it's a projection of what the authors are actually doing themselves. The vast majority of skeptics like myself have no funding, and we do this to counter the massively funded disinformation campaign like the one which Scientific American is engaging in. After this miserable hit piece was published, Steve Koonin contacted Scientific American and asked to print a rebuttal. This is his rebuttal, which Scientific American refused to print. It's a simple scientific rebuttal without ad hominem attack, unlike the one which Scientific American did publish. I've been watching Scientific American very closely for a number of years, and they'll publish essentially any garbage which supports climate alarmism. And they only allow one side to be heard. Even after posting a slanderous hit piece, they refuse to allow a rebuttal from Steve Koonin. Now let's take a look at a little bit of the junk science which Scientific American is pushing in their article. They say that the rate of sea level rise has quadrupled since the Industrial Revolution. But if we look at the 1990 IPCC report, they say there's no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. For longer periods, however, there's weak evidence for an acceleration over the last 2 to 3 centuries. That certainly doesn't sound anything like a quadrupling of sea level rise rates or that mankind had anything to do with it. The reality is that tide gauges don't show any acceleration in sea level rise over the last century and a half. Sea level is rising at the same rate now at Manhattan as it was when Abraham Lincoln was president. And it's the same story at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Sea level is rising at the same rate now as it was 110 years ago. And at Astoria, Oregon, sea level is falling at the same rate as it was a century ago. Steve Koonin is fighting the sort of lies being pushed by these authors in Scientific American. Now let's take a look at this author, Andrew Dessler. 10 years ago, Texas was having an extremely hot, dry summer. Andrew Dessler wrote this article in the Houston Chronicle. He said, "Get used to the hot and dry weather. The weather of the 21st century will be very much like the hot and dry weather of 2011. But Texas has been getting wetter over the last 120 years and have actually had their wettest years on record since Dessler made his prediction in 2011. Now let's look at the raw, untampered Texas temperature data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The thermometer data shows that Texas used to be much hotter and that the hottest year on record was 1921, 1 century ago. This graph is for the mean temperature in Texas. The next one shows the average maximum temperature. Once again, the hottest year in Texas was 1921, and Texas was generally much hotter prior to 60 years ago. Texas had their longest heat wave 100 years ago when Encino had 157 consecutive days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit from May 8, 1921 to October 11, 1921. The New York Times reported in 1921 that Earth had a fever. They said there was a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. The New York Herald reported death for millions in 1921's record heat wave. The heat and drought of 1921 put millions of people at risk in Europe, Russia, and Asia. Across the entire United States, 1921 had the second highest average maximum temperature after 1934. And on this date 100 years ago was one of the deadliest floods in U.S. history. Flooding on the Arkansas River around Pueblo, Colorado killed about 1,500 people. It was known as the Great Flood of 1921 and ran from June 3rd through June 5th. The water rose 15 feet above street level. This is what Pueblo, Colorado looked like 100 years ago today. And if we go back to the 1921 New York Times article, they said that the year was marked by typhoons, waterspouts, hailstorms, floods, and hurricanes in many widely separated parts, from Kamchatka to Cape Horn and from Guam to Guadeloupe. Obviously, the weather in 1921 was very hot and very extreme. It was marked by heat waves, famine, droughts, and floods. Alaska had an unprecedented heat wave 100 years ago. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that Nome never got below 75 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 months. In October of 1921, London and Paris had phenomenal record heat waves. In 1989, Tom Karl, the longtime head of the National Climatic Data Center at NOAA, made it clear that 1921 was a very hot year. He said, "Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. But if you look at current temperature graphs from NOAA and NASA, they show the exact opposite. They show that 1921 was one of the coldest years on record. They show that Earth cooled from 1880 to 1921 and then warmed from 1921 to 1979, which is the exact opposite of what NOAA was saying 30 years ago. These graphs from NASA and NOAA are completely fraudulent and have no basis in reality. Let's take a look at what was going on in the world during what NASA claims were very cold years during the 1920s. They say that 1921 was one of the coldest years on record, when in fact it was one of the hottest. In 1923, it was reported that Glacier National Park was melting so fast that it was in danger of losing all of its glaciers in 25 years, or by the year 1948. Glaciers were vanishing, and scientists reported a radical change in climatic conditions in the Arctic, with hitherto unheard-of high temperatures. Famous explorer Stephenson reported the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was thin, rotten young ice. Climate alarmists like to claim that the ice was very thick 100 years ago around the North Pole, but that simply isn't true. This graph from NASA and similar ones from NOAA and other government agencies have nothing to do with reality. They're propaganda, not science. The reason that Scientific American will write hit pieces against people like Steve Koonin but not allow them to respond is because Scientific American is supporting a massive big money scam. NASA tampering with temperature data isn't going to bring back the people who starved to death in 1921's record heat and drought. History doesn't lie, but some key climate scientists who work for the government do. Last week, Daily Kos wrote a hit piece on Steve Malloy and myself. Of course, they didn't contact me, and they didn't give me an opportunity to respond. These writers never do, because if they did allow me to respond, their readers would understand that they're spreading nonsense. The press and social media only allow one point of view to be heard. They attacked the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for expressing an opinion on climate change. If only he had the scientific credentials of Greta Thunberg, Al Gore, or Leo DiCaprio, then perhaps the press and social media would allow him to speak. Twitter just banned a website for posting Dr. Fauci's emails, which were obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. Doing this didn't violate any of Twitter's policies, but Twitter shut them down anyway, because Twitter is a big part of the propaganda machine. The emails show that Donald Trump was probably right about the origins of the disease in China. But social media doesn't allow Donald Trump's opinions to be heard because he keeps telling the truth about things which they want silenced. Facebook just banned President Donald Trump for 2 more years because they don't like him telling the truth. Never mind that President Trump won 80% of U.S. counties. The contempt from Facebook and Twitter against the American people is on display for all to see. There's huge amounts of money being spent to keep the public from hearing factual information about many different topics. Barack Obama said the only people who don't want to disclose the truth are the people with something to hide, and he was an expert on that topic. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this fraud and insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.